to my show, Searching for Integrity. My name really is John Smith, and I'm searching for people with integrity. Why? Because our country suffers from IDD, Integrity Deficit Disorder. Today, I'm broadcasting from Greensboro, North Carolina. We're waiting here for a track meet to begin. My grandson, Brendan, qualified for the 400 meter dash for the AAU national competition this afternoon. We'll have more of that later on. Um, I have a variety of news articles, mostly discussions regarding Congress, the Senate, the White House. As you know, I'm the author of my book, memoir titled Embracing the Abyss. And I'll begin with these lessons that we've learned or should have learned from the past. And as we roll through these lessons, hopefully we'll come out better people on the other end. We're going to begin with the lessons from the great inflation of 1973 to 1981. Then as now that drove higher prices was excess demand owing to runaway government spending. Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker understood. This is an article, Phil Graham and Mike Solon and President Ronald Reagan. History withholds its wisdom from those who ignore its lessons. 40 years ago this month, the fiscal policy of President Ronald Reagan and the monetary police of policy of Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker broke the back of the 20th century's most destructive inflation, ushered in an economic expansion that effectively lasted a quarter of a century and banished inflation until now. The buildup to the Great Inflation started in 1966 when Congress, at the urging of the Johnson administration, expanded funding for both the war in Vietnam and the war on poverty. This guns and butter policy produced a double-digit surge in federal spending. By 1973, inflation was running at 8.7% and would average 9.2% for 9 years, far surpassing average inflation of 3.3% between 1946 and 1972, and 2.7% from 1982 through 2019. During the 73-81 Great Inflation, even after adjusting for inflation, federal revenue rose by an average 4.1% a year. The share of the economy taken by the federal government in taxes rose by nearly 1/8, from 17% to 19.1%. That's astonishing because Congress never voted to raise income taxes during that period. In fact, after LBJ's 1968 temporary tax surcharge, which didn't slow inflation, Congress cut federal taxes in 1971, 75, 76, and 1977. So how did taxes rise at a record pace? Surreptitiously and automatically through inflation and bracket creep. As the Congressional Budget Office explained in 1980, taxpayers with two dependents earning $15,000, around $57,000 in 2022 dollars, and filing a joint return would pay $294 more in federal income taxes, those are dollars, and 23.8% rise in tax liability. If the family's adjusted gross income itemized deductions rose by 13.3%. The inflation rate of 1979. With 16 tax brackets and 9% inflation over the period, bracket creep increased taxes as a share of gross domestic product by 2.1%, dwarfing the later Clinton and Obama tax increases combined. But record tax increases couldn't keep pace with spending. Annual real federal spending increased by 4%, defense fell by 1.6%. As a share of GDP, total spending rose 2.6%, defense fell by 1.5%. Almost a one-third increase in the share of national income being spent by the federal government on social spending. Compare that with the New Deal. Social spending rose by then unheard of 2% of GDP from 1933 to 1939. Guns and butter ignited excess demand and inflation in 1966. By the way, that's when I graduated from high school. But butter has fueled excess demand and inflation ever since. Monetary policy has accommodated these fiscal excesses and supply disruptions, including those caused by the 6-month Arab oil embargo in 1973 and the pandemic shutdown in 2020 exacerbated them. But federal spending has driven inflation in post-war America. When Reagan took office in January 1981, the inflation rate was 12.5%. The tax burden and the level of federal spending was both post-war highs, respectively 19.1% and 21.6% of GDP. By the end of this Reagan presidency, real average annual federal spending growth had declined to 2.5% from 4.3%, and social spending to grow 1.9% for 6.3%. Real annual defense spending has grown to 4.3%. As a share of the economy, total federal spending had fallen by 1% and social spending by 1.5%. Defense spending had risen 0.5%. Reagan achieved his spending restraint during a deep recession, which saw unemployment rise to 10%. The Federal Reserve's tightening sent prime interest rates to 20.5% in 1981. Neither Reagan nor Volcker ever flinched. In addition to dramatically reducing the real growth in government spending and excess demand, Reagan cut taxes, creating incentives to work, save, and invest. Congress indexed individual tax brackets for inflation beginning in 1985. Reagan built on Jimmy Carter's transformational deregulation effort, completing the decontrol of oil and gas prices and further lightening regulatory burdens across the economy. Those efforts cut the cost of moving people and products by 50% and gave America the world's most efficient supply chain. In conjunction with Fed monetary tightening, cutting spending, taxes, and the regulatory burden brought inflation down quickly. By fall 1982, inflation had been cut in half by the end of Reagan's first term. It was reduced to normal levels, where it remained until the 2020s. When the sharp drop in the inflation rate bracket creep revenue, the CBO had assumed we'd be generated 1982 to 84 failed to materialize. The drop in inflation alone reduced bracket creep tax increases by $108 billion in those 3 years. The double-dip recessions of 1982 to 1980 slashed revenue by another $184 billion. According to CBO, the plummeting of inflation in the 82 sessions cost the Treasury $292 billion, more than the static cost estimate of $208 billion for the Reagan tax cuts between 82 and 84. The Reagan tax cut reduced the tax burden from 19.1% to 17% in 8 years, reversing 68.5% of the 9-year bracket. A lot of percentages here, a lot of percentages. The economic recovery effectively lasted 25 years until the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, which most of us are going to remember. During the pandemic, total federal spending exploded as government spent in 2 years what it had spent in 3 years before the pandemic. The Federal Reserve accommodated this fiscal explosion by buying or offsetting 3/4 of all the government debt incurred. The money supply expanded in the fastest rate in post-war history. With inflation running at 9.1% and negative growth for the past 2 quarters, President Biden continues to press for massive increases in taxes and spending. Even though stimulus spending has ended, the Biden budget for fiscal 2023 calls for spending of 30% more than the pre-pandemic 2019 nominal level. President Biden continues to press for massive increases in taxes and spending. Even though stimulus spending has ended, the Biden budget for fiscal 2023 calls for spending 30% more than the pre-pandemic 2019 nominal level. By executive order, regulatory appointments, and antitrust actions, Mr. Biden has imposed the nation's heaviest peacetime regulatory burden. He continues to attack big oil, big banks, big tech, and big grocers, and continues to search for price fixing, all policies that failed in the 1970s. Mr. Biden is pursuing policies that are the exact opposite of the policies Reagan used to stop the inflation and revive the economy. Mr. Biden may think he can tax, spend, and regulate America out of the inflation and recession. History suggests otherwise. And it certainly does. It's pretty clear how it's the opposite. Next item, article by Gerald Baker of the Wall Street Journal. Inflation Reduction Act is an insult to used car salesmen. Just as some claims made in business are so evidently fictitious that even the most shameless of hucksters will recoil from articulating them, so propositions and events in politics are so dishonest that even the most mendacious politician will avoid association with them. Then there's the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. If you've been convinced by used car salesmen that the 20-year-old rusting hulk out back with the dodgy chassis and the blue smoke pouring out of the exhaust is a reliable pre-owned bargain, you're going to love the Inflation Reduction Act. This, you will know, is the new name that has been conferred by Senate Democrats and the White House on the remnants of the old Build Back Better bill, the vastly ambitious tax and spending measure that was nearly foisted on an unsuspecting American public last year in the middle of a pandemic. Like that lemon sitting at the back of the dealer's lot, it's been given a little touch-up, a fresh coat of paint, a reduced price tag, and a bright new description. The master plan that was going to save the planet from extinction a year ago has been repurposed as a fully functional inflation-fighting weapon, laser focused on reducing price pressures in the American economy. I'm being a little unfair to used car dealers. Surely not even the most optimistic of charlatans would take his customer for that kind of a fool. Start with the premise for the principal claim in the bill, namely that the package $739 billion in tax increases and reduced outlays and a little $433 billion in new spending will produce a historic 300 plus billion reduction in the federal deficit over 10 years to fight inflation. True, deficit reduction should, other things being equal, reduce aggregate demand and deflation. We'll come to the economic wisdom and plausibility of the specific measures shortly, but it's worth noting that in the very first sentence of their summary, the Democrats hand up a self-indictment of almost everything they've been doing in the 18 months since the party took the Senate and the White House. If a bill that reduces the deficit by 300 billion over 10 years represents inflation reduction, what we are to make of law Congress passed last year that increased the deficit by an estimated 1.7 trillion in less than 2 years. If we are in the business of renaming legislative measures with a bill that is going to reduce inflation through deficit reduction, can we now all agree to call the American Rescue Plan of 2021, which added 6 times as much to the deficit in 1/5 of the time, the Inflation Acceleration Act? Question mark. Then take a look at what the Democrats' new bill actually achieves in deficit reduction. Because the spending provisions kick in more quickly than the revenue raising provisions, the bill would actually increase the deficit in its first few years. According to the Penn-Wharton budget model, it would begin to reduce the deficit only in 2027. Wow. So the Inflation Reduction Act, sold to Americans on the basis that it will reduce the surging inflation, the Democrats themselves helped unleash, won't even have any downward effect on the deficit for 5 years. I'm skeptical about the average lawmaker's ability to predict the inflation rate in 5 years, but if we have to wait until 2027 to get on top of the current cost of living crisis, we're in trouble. As for those tax increases that kick in straight away, especially the minimum corporate tax rate, not only are they outweighed by the spending increases, but they make no sense at all for an economy that is clearly contracting at an alarming pace. Democrats claim that some measures, such as enabling Medicare to negotiate drug prices, will tamp down inflation, but that's largely speculative. And the independent Penn-Wharton analysis sees no overall impact on inflation. Of course it doesn't. That's not what the bill was ever intended to do. Tear off the absurd Inflation Reduction Act label, and behind it you will see, illuminated by the excited growth of media coverage of the Democrats' premature victory laps, exactly what it is: another large plank in the Democratic plan to re-engineer the U.S. economy, with another hefty expansion of government, disappointingly enabled in part, by the way, by congressional Republicans who cleared a path for its helping pass another bill subsidizing semiconductor producers. The left's increasingly shrill claims of a climate emergency have always been a thin veneer to cover their ambitions to take over large swaths of the American economy. It all amounts to a breathtaking piece of policy-making chutzpah worthy of the most unscrupulous salesman's patter. Having created the inflationary mess in the first place, Democrats now aim to con the country into believing that they're cleaning it up, even as they steal a further march in their plan to remake the country. If anyone thinks that's what America voted for 2 years ago, I have a used car to sell them. Wow, I got chills over that one. That's what they say and what they do are 2 different things. It's very interesting. Next article. Democrats try to undo the best part of Trump's legacy. Voters rejected his bad behavior. His policies on taxes and regulation were largely successful pre-pandemic. This is by Jason Riley, Wall Street Journal. The Democratic Party has a more complicated relationship with Donald Trump than it likes to admit. It wants voters to remember the nonstop chaos of his administration, his Twitter rants. Now he debased the presidency on January the 6th and won't stop lying about the 2020 election results. Fair enough. But Democrats also need voters to forget the success of the pre-pandemic economy and support efforts to reverse policies that abetted faster growth. The reality is that when Mr. Trump wasn't embarrassing himself, he was advancing a more and less traditional Republican agenda of lower taxes and lighter regulations. The upshot was an acceleration in economic activity, higher lower labor force participation rates, and narrowing the racial inequality. During Trump's first 3 years in office, median household incomes grew, inequality diminished, and the poverty rate among black people fell below 20% for the first time in post-World War II records. The Journal reported in October 2020. The Journal. The unemployment rate among black people went under 6% for the first time in records going back to 1972. Minorities weren't the only beneficiaries of this movement. Between 2017 and 2019, wages for the bottom 10% of earners grew at more than double the rate they did during President Obama's second term. This record is all the more impressive because it defied expectations. The growth of gross domestic product during Mr. Obama's final year in office was only about half of what it had been a year earlier, which prompted no shortage of doom and gloom economic forecasts for the Trump presidency. Nevertheless, in 2017, 2018, and 2019, the unemployment rate came in below what the Federal Reserve had predicted, while GDP was higher than anticipated. GDP, gross domestic product. Democrats are loath to give Mr. Trump's tax and regulatory agenda any credit for these outcomes, but the economy performed in the main just as administration officials and supply side economic modeling predicted. Lower corporate tax rates were intended to reverse the downward trend in business investment, and following their implementation, major companies announced wage hikes, bonuses, and 401k match increases. In the 2-year period after the 2017 tax reform passed, household incomes rose by more than they had in the previous 8 years combined. Let me repeat that. In the 2-year period, 2017, household incomes rose by more than had previous 8 years combined. Well, the reason this history is important because Democrats, via the Inflation Reduction Act, unveiled last week, want to raise the taxes that Mr. Trump cut. No matter what it's called, the legislation is another tax and spending bonanza that will do little, if anything, to reduce inflation. The passage could discourage the kind of this investment we saw before COVID. And because corporate levies are borne mainly by employees, higher taxes on businesses can also lead to lower wages and less hiring. The White House seems to be under the impression that Mr. Trump got the boot in 2020 because of his stewardship of the economy, and that voters want his economic policies reversed. But the economy is one area where Mr. Trump consistently polled strongest and was elected in 2016 in large part because of the sluggish growth under Mr. Obama. As Mr. Obama's vice president, Joe Biden, rode shotgun through the slowest economic recovery since World War II. a recovery that finally kicked into gear after tax reforms opposed by most Democrats in Congress took effect. Democrats are in a bind with inflation at a 40-year high, violent crime rates spiraling upward, and border situation that even has Democratic mayors of sanctuary cities complaining about too many illegal immigrants. The midterm elections could be significantly worse than typically are for the party that controls the White House. Not all of Mr. Trump's economic policies are worth preserving. His trade war with China has been a bust. It didn't reverse a U.S. decline in manufacturing as the White House promised. Rather, it helped some manufacturers while hurting others for a net loss overall. Yet instead of reducing tariffs on Chinese goods, which increased prices for the U.S. consumer at a time when people are already feeling pinched, the Biden administration has decided to target tax cuts that can be shown empirically to have benefit the working class. Whether the issue is crime, immigration, or the economy, Democrats are putting progressivism ahead of pragmatism and believe that the defeat of Mr. Trump in 2020 gives them license to do so. But Mr. Trump lost his bid for a second term because the country grew tired of his behavior, which should be confused with his economic and political agenda. It might take a midterm shellacking for the left to finally figure out why Joe Biden was elected. Very interesting. Very interesting. Uh, I'm glad to have shared these articles with you. They get you an idea of what's a better idea of what's going on and what we can often expect here in the near future, depending upon the next 6 months up to the mid months of October, November. I would like to thank you to my audience for tuning in, for searching for integrity and news. So long and happy trails to all. John Smith, adios, signing off. Thanks. Bye.